Let's rewind to 1979. Disco was in full swing, and a book called The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism was about to drop a bombshell. It was penned by Noam Chomsky, a linguistics rock star, and Edward S. Herman, a finance whiz. They tackled America's cozy relationship with unsavory regimes around the world. This book wasn't just academic, it was an exposé on US foreign policy. They argued that America, the supposed beacon of democracy, had been propping up brutal dictators in the name of fighting communism. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we're facing a new wave of authoritarianism. Right-wing strongmen are popping up globally, and the lessons from Chomsky and Herman's book are eerily relevant. We see governments cracking down on dissent and silencing journalists. The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism is a cautionary tale. It reminds us that even the most powerful nation can get sucked into realpolitik. By understanding past mistakes, we can chart a better future. We'll delve into the book's arguments, historical examples, and its implications for today. Trust us, it's a journey you won't want to miss. Chomsky and Herman shatter the myth that the US is a benevolent superpower spreading democracy. They argue that US foreign policy is about maintaining American hegemony. Terms like national interest and fighting communism are smokescreens for power. The US has supported brutal dictators to stay top dog in the global order. These regimes were seen as valuable allies against communism. Chomsky and Herman argue that the US government undermines democratic movements that threaten its interests. The book is full of examples of democratically elected governments being toppled and uprisings crushed with US support. From Iran in 1953 to Chile in 1973, the US has a history of meddling with disastrous consequences. These interventions were morally reprehensible and strategically short-sighted. By propping up dictators, the US created power vacuums filled by more extreme forces. The self-proclaimed leader of the free world has a habit of suppressing freedom when politically expedient. How does the US government sell these interventions to the public? Enter Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model. It's a sophisticated analysis of how media functions in a capitalist democracy, often serving as an unwitting mouthpiece for the state. The media is shaped by economic and political forces that filter out dissenting voices. Chomsky and Herman identify 5 filters that shape news coverage, creating a bias in favor of powerful interests. Even well-intentioned journalists can end up producing biased news. The media's bias often isn't deliberate, it's subtle and unconscious. Journalists internalize dominant narratives, legitimizing US foreign policy. By framing issues in a particular way, the media shapes public opinion and creates consent for intervention. The media often relies on official sources, presenting a biased narrative. The public is kept in the dark about the true nature of US foreign policy. Let's look at Indonesia under General Suharto. In 1965, a supposed communist coup attempt triggered mass killings with US support. The US provided Suharto with lists of suspected communists and weapons. While this was happening, the US praised Suharto for bringing stability. They overlooked the mass murders because he was a reliable anti-communist. This is one of the most chilling case studies in Chomsky and Herman's book. The Indonesian saga gets grimmer with the invasion of East Timor. In 1975, Indonesia invaded East Timor with US approval, leading to mass violence. The US provided military aid and blocked international condemnation. The media largely ignored this horrific chapter. This silence was a result of the filters in the propaganda model. Media outlets were reluctant to criticize a key US ally. Operation Condor in Latin America is another dark chapter. This top-secret program involved the systematic assassination of political opponents. The US provided training, intelligence, and torture equipment to South American dictatorships. Operation Condor aimed to crush leftist movements and maintain US dominance. The media downplayed the horrors, framing them as isolated incidents. This created a climate of fear and repression. Chomsky and Herman examined US interventions in Guatemala, Chile, Vietnam, and Cambodia. The US aligned with authoritarian regimes undermining democratic values. The 1954 CIA-backed coup in Guatemala toppled a democratically elected government. The Vietnam War was driven by a fear of communism and a desire for influence. The US created narratives to justify its actions, often with media help. These interventions led to instability, violence, and mistrust of the US. The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism is an indictment of US foreign policy. Chomsky and Herman argue that the US prioritizes its interests over the well-being of people in the developing world. The US has a double standard on human rights, condemning enemies while ignoring allies' abuses. The rhetoric of freedom masks the pursuit of power. The book is a call to action for Americans to demand better foreign policy. A more just world is possible, but it requires breaking free from propaganda. Demand a foreign policy rooted in human rights, not self-interest. Chomsky and Herman argue that the media shapes reality by deciding what stories to cover and how to frame them. They call this manufacturing consent. The media helps to manufacture public support for the government's agenda. This isn't about a grand conspiracy, but structural biases in the media system. The 5 filters shape the flow of information, ensuring certain stories dominate. This process channels information in a particular direction, influencing public consciousness. Section 2, Worthy Victims versus Unworthy Victims, the hierarchy of human suffering. One of the most disturbing aspects of the propaganda model is how it creates a hierarchy of human suffering. Chomsky and Herman argue that the media tends to care more about some victims than others, depending on who's doing the victimizing and what's at stake geopolitically. They point out that when atrocities are committed by enemy states or groups, the media is quick to condemn them, often in very emotional terms. These victims are deemed worthy of our sympathy and outrage. Think about the coverage of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, or the genocide in Rwanda. However, when similar atrocities are committed by the US or its allies, the media response is often more muted, if not entirely absent. These victims become unworthy, their suffering deemed less important or somehow justified by the larger geopolitical context. Think about the coverage of the US bombing of Cambodia or the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. This selective empathy, Chomsky and Herman argue, is a direct result of the propaganda model. The media, beholden to powerful interests and conditioned to see the world through a particular lens, ends up normalizing certain forms of violence while demonizing others. Section 3. The filter bubble. How dissent is silenced before it even starts. But it's not just about ignoring or downplaying certain stories. Chomsky and Herman argue that the propaganda model also works by actively marginalizing dissenting voices. It's like creating a filter bubble where only certain perspectives are considered acceptable, while others are deemed too radical, too fringe, or simply too inconvenient to be taken seriously. Think about how often you see experts critical of US foreign policy interviewed on mainstream news channels. Chances are, not very often. Chomsky and Herman argue that this isn't a coincidence. It's because the media, consciously or unconsciously, tends to rely on a narrow pool of experts who can be relied upon to toe the official line. These experts, often former government officials, military leaders or think tank analysts, provide a veneer of objectivity and authority while subtly reinforcing the dominant narrative. They become the go-to sources for journalists looking for a quick quote or a seemingly balanced perspective. Meanwhile, dissenting voices like Chomsky and Herman themselves are often relegated to the fringes, dismissed as conspiracy theorists, or simply ignored altogether. Their analyses, no matter how well researched or well argued, are deemed too radical, too critical, or simply too inconvenient to fit within the narrow parameters of acceptable discourse. Section 4. The illusion of choice. How the media manufactures consensus. Chomsky and Herman argue that the media creates an illusion of choice, masking a consensus among elites. It's like a play where actors say different words but read the same script. Think about the Iraq War in 2003. The media largely presented the war as necessary, amplifying the Bush administration's claims. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate attempt to manufacture consent. The illusion of choice makes people think they're informed while they're subtly manipulated. Section 5. The power of narrative, framing the debate, shaping the world. Ultimately, Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model is about the power of narrative. It's about how the stories we tell ourselves, the frameworks we use to understand the world, can have a profound impact on our perceptions, our beliefs, and ultimately our actions. They argue that the media, by controlling the narrative, by deciding which stories are deemed important and how they're framed, has an enormous amount of power to shape public opinion and influence policy decisions. It can make war seem inevitable, injustice seem normal, and even the most outrageous lies seem plausible. Chomsky and Herman challenge us to be critical consumers of information, to question the narratives we're being fed, and to seek out alternative perspectives. They believe that by becoming more aware of the propaganda model and its insidious effects, we can start to break free from its grip and create a more just and equitable world. Their work is a stark reminder that the fight for a better world is not just about changing policies, it's about changing minds, it's about challenging the dominant narratives that justify injustice and inequality and creating new stories that empower people to imagine and fight for a better future. Section 1. Echoes of the past, from the Cold War to the War on Terror. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but that was then, this is now. Surely things have changed since the Cold War, right? Well, hold on to your hats, folks, because Chomsky and Herman's analysis is about to get eerily relevant to the 21st century. Remember how the US justified propping up dictators during the Cold War by saying they were fighting communism? Well, swap out communism for terrorism and you've got yourself the playbook for the War on Terror. It's the same song, just a slightly different tune. Chomsky and Herman argue that the War on Terror, much like the Cold War, has provided a convenient pretext for the US to intervene in other countries, often in ways that undermine democracy and human rights. They point to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the drone strikes in Yemen and Somalia, and the support for authoritarian regimes in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia as prime examples. They argue that the War on Terror has become a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating more instability, more resentment, and ultimately more terrorism. By focusing narrowly on military solutions and ignoring the root causes of terrorism, such as poverty, inequality, and political oppression, the US is simply perpetuating a cycle of violence that seems to have no end in sight. Section 2. The Propaganda Playbook, Recycled Tactics for a New Millennium. But here's the real kicker. The propaganda model hasn't just survived, it's thrived in the age of 24/7 news cycles, social media, echo chambers, and a fragmented media landscape. Chomsky and Herman's 5 filters are more relevant than ever, shaping the way we understand the world and influencing our perceptions of complex geopolitical events. Think about the media coverage of the Syrian civil war, for example. Chomsky and Herman would argue that the focus on the atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad's regime, while justified, has often come at the expense of a broader understanding of the conflict including the role of other actors such as the US, Russia, and various rebel groups. They might also point to the use of emotionally charged language, the reliance on official sources, and the marginalization of dissenting voices as evidence of the propaganda model at work. The result is a public that is often ill-equipped to grapple with the complexities of the conflict and to hold their own leaders accountable for their role in it. And don't even get them started on the rise of fake news and disinformation. Chomsky and Herman would argue that while these phenomena are certainly concerning, they're not entirely new. Propaganda, disinformation, and the manipulation of information have always been tools of the powerful. And the internet has simply provided new and more effective ways to spread them. Section 3, The Emperor's New Clothes, Questioning the Narrative in the Age of Information. Now, you might be feeling a bit despondent at this point, so is there any hope, you might ask? Are we doomed to be pawns in a game controlled by powerful elites and their media mouthpieces? Well, not so fast. Chomsky and Herman wouldn't let you off the hook that easily. While they're certainly critical of the media and its role in perpetuating power structures, they also believe in the power of critical thinking, informed dissent, and an engaged citizenry. They argue that the first step towards change is awareness. Once we understand how the propaganda model works, we can start to see through its illusions and challenge its narratives. The good news is that we live in an age where information is more accessible than ever before. We have the tools at our fingertips to fact-check claims, seek out alternative perspectives, and connect with others who are challenging the status quo. The challenge is cutting through the noise, developing critical thinking skills, and being willing to question the narratives that we've been taught to accept as truth. Chomsky and Herman would urge us to be skeptical of official narratives, to question the motives of those in power, and to demand evidence to support claims. They would also encourage us to seek out a diversity of voices and perspectives, especially those that challenge our own assumptions and biases. Section 4, The Responsibility to Dissent, Chomsky's call to action for the digital age. But it's not enough to simply be passive consumers of information, critically analyzing everything we read and hear. Chomsky and Herman would argue that we have a responsibility to act on our beliefs, to challenge injustice, and to hold those in power accountable for their actions. This might involve engaging in peaceful protest, supporting organizations that are working to promote human rights and social justice, or simply having difficult conversations with friends and family members who hold different views. It might involve supporting independent media outlets, boycotting companies that profit from war and exploitation, or contacting our elected officials to voice our concerns. Chomsky and Herman believe that change happens from the bottom up through the collective action of informed and engaged citizens. They argue that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to speak out and demand a better world. They remind us that throughout history it has been the voices of dissent, the people who dared to challenge the status quo and demand a more just and equitable world, who have brought about meaningful change. From the abolition of slavery to the fight for women's suffrage to the civil rights movement, progress has always been driven by those who refuse to accept the world as it is and dare to imagine a better future. Section 5, Fighting the Good Fight Towards a More Just and Equitable Foreign Policy. The Washington Connection and Third World Fascism is a searing indictment of US foreign policy. Chomsky and Herman's work calls for a more just and equitable world. Their legacy inspires countless individuals and organizations. Their message is as relevant today as ever. Question the narrative, seek out alternative perspectives, speak out against injustice, because a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Why Chomsky's work still matters today? Chomsky and Herman's work is a punch to the gut that keeps on giving. The US often plays a different game on the world stage, with devastating consequences. This isn't just ancient history. The manipulation of information still happens today. From the war on terror to tensions with China and Russia, the US asserts its dominance, often at the expense of others. Chomsky and Herman's work is a call to action. Get informed, get involved, and challenge the narratives. Never underestimate the power of an informed citizenry.